Today's speakers are Mark Ethier, CEO of Isotope, an industry-leading audio technology company, a Grammy winner. They produced Kanye West's last album. Just kidding. About that part, they are a Grammy winner. I think our only Grammy winner that will be presenting this breakfast series. And an Innovation Awards winner from last year, 2014. Along with Bill Joyner, president of ChangeWise, a Boston-based leadership and organization development firm, who will be presenting along with Mark. The road to Isotope's success hasn't always been easy, despite the fine legal representation they get from Morris, Barnes, Brown, and Pendleton. Mark is going to share with you some of his most important learning experiences in leading an early-stage company. He will describe difficult challenges he faced and how he was able to reframe these challenges to bring them to resolution and propel his company forward. Mark holds degrees in music and computer science from MIT. He earned his BA and MBA, Bill earned his BA and MBA from Southern Methodist University and a doctorate in organizational development from Harvard University. Please welcome Mark Ethier and Bill Joyner.
So like Bob was introducing, I wanted to share some of the challenges I've had. Now, I'm assuming everyone is here because you're trying to learn. You're trying to figure out how do you approach your challenges differently. How do you learn how to do something that you were doing last week differently next week? And so I've been through a lot of challenges, a lot of failures as a company. And so I figured I could share some of those challenges to hopefully help some of you learn. I've invited Bill, who's a coach and consultant that I've worked with for years, to help frame some of these things, because I can talk about my own anecdotal experience. If I'm really honest with all of you, this is my first job. I started this as an undergrad, so I'm still learning what to do. So the great thing is Bill is able to put some of this in context with other companies and the rest of the world. So I want to start with a really quick history of Isotope. So like I said, I started this in college. I was studying computer science and music, knew I wanted to start a company, didn't know in what. So I got some friends together, we made some products, put them up online, lots of people downloaded them, and that was enough for us to be convinced that we should go out and spend the summer living and working in a basement, basically, and put up our first product for sale on a website at the end of that summer. And we sold enough copies that we had money for food and rent, and we bootstrapped the company over the next 10 years. We've been very lucky, I think somewhat through luck, honestly, but through our tenacity to be able to grow the company year over year, always doing better than we did last year, always being profitable because we had bootstrapped the company. But it also got to the place where 10 years later, as you can imagine, I started with 6 founders, we were down to 2, and a lot of things happen when you start a company at 20 and then you're in your 30s, late 20s, early 30s. And so at that point, we started to run into some challenges. So as you can imagine, when we started, everything was on the same page. But then as the company grew, and at this point, we were probably about 30 people, and so how we had been working when we started the company started to break down. It wasn't working in the same way. So I sort of felt like, okay, we had this thing where, as you can imagine, as a small company, we're very focused on the tactical day-to-day. How are we doing our work? But it seemed like, as founders especially, we need to figure out how do we step away from that. We were very much focused on, we have these people, we need to make sure we get the most out of them, as opposed to starting to build and empower teams. So it's very much about individuals, what can they do? Let's make sure they're all optimized in what they're doing. We also were very much focused on short-term plans. One of the upsides of being a bootstrapped company is you have a very good focus on we need to make money. One of the downsides is you can get stuck in that rut of, okay, how are we going to make that next paycheck, basically? So the next thing was, as part of that, we were very focused on how do we make sure we get this next project completed, as opposed to how do we take some risks for the long term, because we're going to be around for a while. Finally, that led us to, when we had employees, we were thinking very short term, so it was, okay, how do we keep you happy day to day, as opposed to taking a big step back and saying, how are we going to make this a really great experience for you over the next 3 to 5 years? So between me and the other founder, we sort of had this company that was running on this left-hand side, and he was very much aligned on, okay, we need to keep doing that. He was very much focused on wanting to eventually change his career path and step away from the business. And I was looking at it and saying, well, no, how do we grow this for the next 3 to 5 years? How do we make this much bigger? And so we were sort of stuck at this impasse where we had two very different philosophies about what we wanted to do with the business. And it was a time when for the previous 10 years, we'd always agreed on everything. We were 50-50 owners. We had to agree. That's just how it worked. So now we get to this place where fundamentally we had very different approaches about how we thought the company should be run, what we wanted out of it long term, and we were stuck. We had lots of very unproductive, long discussions late into the night and weekends, as you can, I'm sure some of you have been through those. And then we had employees who were watching this play out on a day-to-day basis. We'd go into a meeting and we'd be representing these two different philosophies, and you can imagine what that does for morale. As an employee is thinking, okay, I know these two guys are the important guys, but they're really talking about different things. So what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to approach things? And that's where I came across some of Bill's work and research, and I had this book that he had written, which I guess we're raffling off, which is cool. And I've read a lot of business books, more than I want to admit probably. That's part of why I think I've been able to keep my job. But I categorize them in two very gross ways. There are the business books where someone has an experience and they write about it. And it's so very anecdotal, and you have to look at that and say, okay, well, that time, that place, can I reinterpret that and apply it to my business? And that's sort of one class of books. And there's another class of books which I would say are based on science and based on research. And having been an MIT grad, I've always really liked those books because you know, okay, this isn't just one anecdotal experience at one point in time. There's a trend here, there's a pattern here. And that's where Bill's book and his approach was able to really help me think about the things I was going through in a different sort of way. So with that, I'll pass it off to you, Bill.
Handing off. So through Mark's exposure to this book, and also he brought his executive team to our Leadership Agility Change Lab workshop, I just want to give you a couple of key concepts that came out of those experiences for Mark, I think, and then he'll tell you what he actually did with these ideas. So the first thing I want to do is just give you a very brief experience of leadership agility. So I'm going to ask you to do something you probably don't do in many breakfast meetings, which is I'd like you to stand up for just a moment. This will be very quick. So far we have had no serious injuries or embarrassments from this exercise, so hopefully that will hold for today. So what I'd like you to do, just put your stuff down for a minute and get yourself feeling very grounded and rooted on the floor, and maybe bend your knees slightly. And I want you to put your hands like this in front of you and put all of your attention on the space between your hands like a screen, okay? Like you're really focused on this. So this is like any leadership activity that you're doing during the day. You get very absorbed in it, right? And then I want you to just open up your arms and let your vision expand. So you're taking in more and more of the context surrounding this leadership task. You're really stepping back and looking at it with greater perspective. And then once you get that perspective, I want you to sort of bring that back into a focus on whatever needs to be done next. Okay? So thank you for indulging me in that. And this whole metaphor of being able to step back and re-engage, what we found in the 5 years of research that went into the book, we learned a lot about leadership agility, a lot of different nuances, but the real essence of it is this ability to step back from whatever you're really absorbed in and whatever you're assuming is true, to step back and see it in a larger context and then take action. So that runs through everything. Now, the other really key set of thoughts here I want to just say something about is the levels of leadership agility. What we found was that leaders evolve in their capacity to be agile. Agile meaning this ability to step back. And as you go through these different levels of agility, what's essentially happening at the core of it is that your ability to step back gets broader. You can see things in a broader perspective and in a deeper perspective, ultimately taking more of the human dynamics in the business into account. So we have names for these levels, and I'll tell you a little bit about where these come from in a minute, but there's the expert, the achiever, and the catalyst, okay? These build on each other. These are developmental stages, if you will, in leadership. And they're related to the pace of change that's going on in our environment. Everybody's right in the middle of all that, right? And all of the increasing interdependence, all the people we have to work with to make things work. And what we find is that as we evolve through expert, achiever, and catalyst, we see leaders who are increasingly effective in dealing with rapid change and with dealing with these very complex interdependent conditions that we find ourselves in. The research indicates that about 55% of managers are very comfortable and sort of rooted in the expert approach, which I'll describe in a minute, and about 35% achiever. And if you're in the achiever, if you've developed those achiever capacities, that means you can also still do the expert level. But only about 10% have really developed these catalyst level leadership capacities. And they can also do achiever and expert. The reason that's significant is that we found that these are the leaders that are most effective in this incredibly unprecedented world of change and complexity that we're in right now. So this all comes from, or is related to, a pre-existing body of research about developmental stages we go through as human beings. And just a real quick whirlwind, we go through these childhood stages, preschool and grade school and middle school and high school, more or less. And then we get into these expert, achiever, catalyst stages of personal development, which we may or may not develop into, not because we don't have the potential, but we may not have the opportunity or the circumstances that really help us to evolve like that. So now, what are these expert, achiever, and catalyst? Let me give you a quick tour of the three levels. Each one of them has their own mindset about leadership. So the expert mindset is basically, people will lead me because I have authority and because I have really developed an expertise. And that's going to make it compelling for people to follow me. And the way this translates into different leadership arenas is that when I'm trying to lead a change or an improvement in the organization, I'm focused tactically, I'm making incremental improvements, I'm focusing on areas over which I have authority, okay, which doesn't help me very much with cross-functional type changes. And in leading my team, I tend to use what's sometimes called a hub and spoke approach to team leadership, which means I'm very focused on each of the individuals who reports to me, and I'm supervising them and I'm mentoring them, but I'm not really seeing the group of direct reports that are reporting to me as a system that I need to gel into a team. I may call it a team, but that's not really what I'm doing. In pivotal conversations, and by that I mean conversations where important business and organizational outcomes are at stake, if I'm at the expert level, my comfort level with experiencing the discomfort that often comes from working out these different points of view that have to be worked out is not very high. So I tend to gravitate toward either being quite assertive and trying to sort of squelch the feeling of conflict, or I may be very accommodative and sort of tend to let other people get their way. But it tends to be one or the other. Now, at the achiever level, and this is an add-on to the expert, in other words, you still retain the ability to work at the expert level, but the mindset now is more of leadership is about motivating and inspiring other people to make contributions to large objectives. And my approach to organizational change is much more strategic. I'm very explicitly taking into account the environment that is surrounding the issue that I'm addressing, in the way I analyze it, the way I communicate why this change is needed. And I'm also very focused on getting buy-in from my stakeholders. That becomes a really new important thing at the achiever level. With my team, I am now seeing that this is a system of people, and my job is not just to make sure each person is performing optimally, but that this team really gels in how they work with each other. And in terms of pivotal conversations, I have a little bit more comfort with the discomfort of dealing with differences, having tough conversations. And so I do still tend to gravitate toward being more assertive or more accommodative, but I have more of the other style that I can bring into balance with that. Now the catalyst level, which is as I said, much more unusual, and I think is the kind of the leading edge of where we need to develop into our leadership. The way we lead change is we're thinking not just about the strategy and the strategic objectives that we all know is so important, not just about that, but we're also thinking even further down the road, and we're thinking, how can I create a really sustainable, agile organization that can deal with all kinds of things that we can't even anticipate right now? And the way these leaders think is they say, well, we don't know what the strategy needs to be 8 years from now or 9 or 10 years from now, but what we do know is that if we create a culture in this organization where there's a lot of really open communication, where people are really empowered and really communicating with each other inside and outside the organization, we're going to be able to deal with whatever it is that comes along. And they start that process by changing the way their executive team works. So their executive team comes to embody that culture, and they don't try to like roll out a change project until that team becomes the change and can really lead that change together. And there's a much more willingness to have difficult conversations in a very constructive way where they can easily move it back and forth between advocating their views and being very inquiring and understanding of what other people's views are, so it creates a real sense of dialogue. The last thing I want to say here before I turn it back to Mark is that just think of these three levels not as just different styles, but as things that progressively develop and that you can move through in your own development, that the people in your organization can move through in their own development, so that ultimately you're like these Russian dolls in the sense that you have your inner expert, your inner achiever, and you can also operate at the catalyst level. So, after being exposed to all of this stuff, what did Mark actually do with it?
Yeah, so this was a big deal for me because I was in a place where I felt like I was in the middle of a cliche, or as my investment banker put it, we were straight out of central casting. Some founders in a company who had operated a certain way, the company was growing, and now we were challenged because we needed to change the way that we worked. To really realize that wasn't just a matter of I need to do something different, but I need to focus on my own personal development. How am I building the capacities that allow me to deal with that sort of complexity? So the first thing it did is it gave me the chance to really reframe this conflict or disagreement that I had, where it wasn't a matter that I was necessarily going to convince other people. It was sort of realizing, oh, these are fundamentally two different ways of making meaning or having perspective in how things should work. So it's not necessarily something that, as an MIT computer science person, logically, we're just going to talk this out and figure it out. And at some point, it's such a fundamental difference in perspective that it doesn't work that way. Now, because of that, I said, you know what, I felt like the instinct, this is the way that we should be running the company. And I remember that first time I actually started reading Bill's book, and I went, wait a second, yes, that's what I'm going through, yes. And that gave me the confidence to realize, okay, in the context of this larger body of research and kind of what it means to be an effective leader, then I should have the confidence to move forward and change the way that I work. In that, define this long-term vision for the company, which was amazing in the number of changes that it catalyzed, including that there was a mutual decision for this co-founder to leave, which was an incredibly positive experience. We sort of were able to reframe it from the individual day-to-day disagreements we had about what were tactical sort of minutiae in some ways, and put it into the context of a much larger discussion about the philosophy of how we need to approach this business going forward. And the final thing is, for me, that really set forward one of the things about this model of personal development or human development is the very positive thing where you could say, oh, well, that's just the way he is. That's just his personality. That's the way he is. He can't change. And maybe realize, oh, no, actually there is a potential to continue to grow these capacities, to break out of whatever the ways that I've been working and really approach problems in a new way that will allow me to break through the normal barriers that a founder CEO might go through. So that led me to have personal development as not only a personal goal for me, but something that I tried to make part of the culture of the company. As the company grows and the complexity of our market grows, we all need to be growing along with it. So what did that lead to? Some results. With that vision, we went out and we raised $12 million, our first fundraise ever. we grew from what was a $6 million company in 2011, where I could see we were going to start to get stuck. As you can imagine, 2 founders trying to manage everything. If we didn't let go, we weren't going to grow anymore. It wasn't going to happen. We won an Emmy Award. We are trying to win a Grammy Award, so we're almost there. But we did win an Emmy, so I'm pretty proud of that. And we were also named a top place to work, coming from a place where I was very concerned about the morale and how things were going to play out at the company, to being recognized in all of Boston as being one of the top places to work. Okay, great. So we did all that, but it's never that easy. So now we have an investor, we have money, we have this vision. Now there's a whole new set of problems we're dealing with. So first, we had this big vision, and now I had a team that was struggling to figure out, how do I actually convert this into something I should work on day to day? We had a new big business initiative, and it wasn't working. We weren't making progress like we needed to. We, as an executive team that I now put together, they were pretty dissatisfied. We were meeting every day, we were talking all the time, and yet we weren't making progress. We weren't really getting through the important things we needed to do. We weren't able to balance our execution day to day with these really big new initiatives we were trying to push. And all of this, I kind of wondered, well, am I the problem? I don't know. And so this is where I also went to Bill and said, okay, I need an outside perspective. I need someone to come in who can sort of analyze what's going on in the system, what's going on in the company, and to give some perspective from the outside of what might be happening. And he'll now tell you what he learned.
So here, Mark was not just stepping back as an individual and learning about his own leadership effectiveness, but he was engaging his whole executive team and stepping back together. And the way we did this was, first I came to Mark with a online questionnaire I'd put together that synthesized high-performing team characteristics, and we tweaked it and made it, sort of customized it to Isotope. And very quickly, the results of that were, there were a couple of things that people were very satisfied with. The basic question was, for each item, was, how satisfied are you on this particular dimension of high-performing teamwork, and how much would you like to change it? And the 2 things that they really felt good about, first of all, very high level of trust, which is not what most of the time, frankly, comes up as the most satisfied dimension for an executive team. So that's a really strong point. And also a set of core values that everybody was really grounded in. So that was a really positive foundation for working on the things that they were least satisfied with. The least satisfied item was, basically, they did not agree with this statement, which was, we're able to make good decisions without undue delay. So there's the decision-making piece that was important, and those related to their meetings, and also they felt like they really needed a better balance between focusing on the current business, scaling up, and preparing for new business. So when we went off-site, I did a bunch of interviews based on the findings from the questionnaire, and basically I was asking them, why do you think it is that you have trouble making decisions quickly, et cetera? And what do you think you should do about it? So it was kind of like holding a big mirror up, but pulling all together the thoughts of all the different team members, because often the wisdom is sitting there in the team, but there hasn't been a way to really pull it all together. So I used this graphic to kind of pull things together, and this is, I call this the hero sandwich of the senior team. And the key elements were they wanted to so what we worked on at the offsite was getting more common goals, changing the structure of the team in a variety of ways, and also what I call decision cycle practices. In other words, there were a number of things that they needed to do to make sure that they were focusing on the most high priority issues and getting them teed up in such a way that they could have really productive discussions about them and follow through practices to make sure they got implemented. And we also talked about some of the team norms that needed to change. I want to focus mainly here on this thing about decision making, because it was so central to them, and it seems it's so central to most executive teams. Really need a little bit of work on this. We use this little simple diagram that shows 4 different ways to make decisions. Okay, so go left to right. The directive approach, I just say, I'm the team leader, we're going to do this. Okay, it's very simple. Second approach, consultation, is here's what I am thinking of doing. Give me feedback. What do you think? Is this going to work? I want to take your input into account. Then I'll make the decision. Third approach, consensus. Now this is really important to define carefully. This is where the leader is trying to get a real meeting of the minds for everybody on the team, because for whatever reason they feel like we really need a strong consensus and everybody committed to this. But it's not that we have to have unanimity. What we need is everybody to be willing to commit themselves to a particular direction. So after a while, there's a sort of point of view that gels in the team. Maybe not everybody is equally enthusiastic about it, but the leader then says, okay, I'm making the consensus decision for us based on this conversation. Unanimity is in here to contrast with consensus because that is essentially a dynamic where you're saying to the team, we're not moving forward until everybody agrees on this. Okay? And now most executive teams that I've worked with, they tend to lean very heavily on these first two approaches. Very little real focus on consensus, and as a result, they don't get the commitment and all the great ideas that they could get. Occasionally, there are leaders who tend to lean heavily to the right-hand side. Mark was one of those leaders. He was very interested in getting everybody's involvement and input, but he was using a more of a sort of trying implicitly to get unanimity. And so by having this framework, it became much clearer that there was another approach here, well, there's three other approaches here. And one of the things we found with the catalyst level leaders that we studied is that they're good at using all of these whenever they're needed, and they're also very explicit about, okay, this discussion we're having in our executive team is a decision-making discussion. We're going to try to make a decision here. And how we're going to make the decision is, which of these approaches are we going to use?
So this is where we then took this and put it into action. So there are a few different levels of this. One is that we as a team really didn't have a common purpose. We went from that place of, as we talked about before, being all individuals working on things. And we had to, it seemed obvious after the fact, but say, well, why are we a team? Why do we exist as a team? And what are the things that we in common are working on? Which helped to set a frame for then, okay, we have a lot of things we could talk about. What's the important stuff? And that purpose and those goals helped to really define that. So the next level is where we went into our meetings and started having very explicit process by which we said, okay, here are the possible things we could talk about. We're going to get them out on the table ahead of time. We're going to be very clear about, is this a discussion? Is this informational? Is this a decision? And if it's a decision, how are we going to make that decision? So as we went into a meeting, we had already prioritized the work that we needed to do and set a very clear context of what it was going to be. I'm sure some of you have been in a meeting where you go through an entire discussion and then 5 minutes towards the end, someone says, what are we trying to do here? And we had those every day. But by putting a more explicit process in place, we were able to say, well, everybody knows up front, why are we here and what are we trying to do? And at the end of this meeting, we're either going to look at Mark as the leader, or we're going to say, do we have consensus or do we have unanimity? The final thing is this identifying team norms to change. And this was a really interesting one, starting to realize what are the dynamics in the team that cause behaviors that I had that actually, even though I desperately wanted everyone to be participating and saying things, I was actually squelching their opinions. And one interesting one, which was unexpected, was I was so driven to unanimity because I had this experience with my co-founder where we had to agree on everything. It had to be unanimity throughout the years. So I was trying to do this with my executive team. And what ended up happening is if someone had a dissenting view, and it wasn't that big of a deal, they wouldn't bring it up. Because if they did, now ensues an hour-long discussion about what are we going to have for lunch? When is that really worth it? Was that really worth the time? So what it ended up doing is the way that I interacted with that team ended up actually squelching some dissenting views, which would be important to get out on the table. Even if we didn't come to some agreement, at least it would be, people would be aware of the different perspectives. So what did this actually lead to? Where I talked about we were stuck before. We weren't making progress in this new business initiative. We weren't having productive meetings. At a high level, the team performance went up. And how do you measure that? Well, we took the same survey, and I've been using that every quarter to measure how is the team feel about how the team is actually changing over time. And we saw the things we focused on actually improve. That year, we had a $15 million plan. It was pretty aggressive for us. It was 40% growth as a company. And so that was part of the challenge. We were trying to take on this new business initiative. We were trying to scale up our current business, and we're trying to make sure we make our numbers every month. And by really honing in how we worked as a team, we were able to pull off all of these three things. So we made our plan, 99% of our plan. We doubled the number of people at the company. At that point, we went from about 50 to 100 people in that year. We broke through that place where we couldn't figure out how to convert the vision to an actual strategy and established a 5-year strategic plan for the company. We won the SBain Innovation Award as sort of a measure of, okay, we're still, at all of this, we're still keeping things moving. And finally, we were again named a top place to work, when before that, there was a lot of dissatisfaction in the company. So to really take a giant step back and sort of how can you bring some of this in, I'm sure there are a lot of situations here where you can say, yep, I've heard that, I've experienced that, or I've seen my clients go through that. And I wanted to narrow it down to a few things to sort of as takeaways that I hope you can go and put into practice. One is this process, as Bill is talking about, to take a step back. As you're looking in, it's so easy, especially in emotionally charged situations, to get zoomed in on something. So take that exercise to take a step back and really look at the entire picture. Another thing is to be able to exercise a full range of types of leadership. So decision-making practices is one of those. Think about, am I trying to get unanimity? Am I trying to get consensus, directive decision? And really think explicitly about the way you're approaching that. In the same way that Bill talked about these different levels of leadership, expert, achiever, catalyst, where if it's, as we like to say, if the building's on fire, don't try and build the team. Grab some buckets and put out the fire, be an expert. But if you're looking for a longer term growth, think about how do you build up the capacity of the team? And if you're looking for really long term growth, how do you establish a vision for the company that's going to really bring a culture which is going to make the company operate in a different way? Finally, and a simple one, is a focus on personal development and getting feedback. I've been amazed through the growth of Isotope how many times the answer was actually sitting at the table with me, and I just had to ask. And that's part of what I went through with Bill in this offsite is we did a whole bunch of feedback, and it was clear everyone in the room actually knew what needed to happen. It was just important to make a space where we could actually discuss that and figure out how to move forward. So with that, we want to take questions.
Yeah, so I think to repeat, I think the observation is that many founders of companies begin in this sort of expert mode where they're very wedded to their expertise, and they get to a point as the business grows when they may not be the right person to really manage the growth of the business. And Mark is unusual in the sense that he was a person who could do both. And then I think the question was, have you ever helped people realize that they need to step back? And yeah, I have been part of some of those conversations. You know, it's not like you have one conversation, right? It's a whole series of conversations. The other thing I would say that's some light that this leadership agility model sheds on this question is that the conventional wisdom is that you must replace, and that's not always the case. Mark is a good example of that. If you have somebody who either already has good strategic thinking capacity and some good managerial capacity and is willing to grow into that, that can work, but you do need to recognize that you kind of need to shift your whole approach to leadership, which is what Mark did.
What is my long-term plan for the business?
For you personally?
Yeah, well, I think for me personally, I've always looked at the experience of going from starting a company in my dorm room to perhaps someday being the CEO of the company being a public company is possible. I think it's hard to say because I have this context now of what I need to be as a leader as I go through that. And I think it's important for me that the company succeeds, even independent of me. So I can see a time where maybe I'd step away and I'd let someone else run the company to bring it to that next level. But I think personally, I would like to be able to go through that experience, which is part of why I've always had such a strong dedication to, I have to keep improving as a leader because whatever I did last year or last month or last week even isn't necessarily going to be the way that we move forward.
Mark asked for feedback from all of his team members, and those were collected in the interviews and they were discussed at the off-site. Mark did a remarkable job of listening to, taking in that feedback, and it had a palpable effect on the atmosphere and the dynamics of the team and the willingness of other people to step up and look at themselves. So I would say, you know, a takeaway that you could take away from this morning would be, is that something I'd like to do? You know, do I do that? Do I ask for feedback from my executive team? How might I do that in such a way that it would be a constructive conversation?
So the question is there a way to structure the business so that if you have 50-50 ownership, you don't get stuck? And I would almost put it back to There are a lot of people in this room who are probably lawyers saying, I know the answer to that question, I know the answer to that question. I think the answer is when you start the company, because you can imagine we were 20, 21 years old, so we did some research, not on the internet because it wasn't really there, but we found out how to incorporate the company, did it ourselves. And so I think if we had gotten legal help then, they would have put other triggers and other things into place that would have allowed us to actually work through this sort of situation. One of them might have just been to have a board, honestly. That's sometimes, we didn't have a board of directors either. So it was really just the two founders, and we had to agree on everything. So there are a bunch of structures, and I would recommend talking to a lawyer because this is a problem they've solved before. Question is, did we do the right thing when we started the company? No. So no, the question was, did we have a buy-sell agreement or something else like that? And the answer is no, we didn't. Yeah, which made it a great learning experience.